Fontaine is finally here. It's basically knocking at our doors, begging to enter. But don't worry, not literally, you won't be submerged in water as soon as you leave your house, don't worry about it. Ignoring my stupidity for a second, the stream was today, and many details about the Fontaine environment, the new characters that are coming out, have been officialized. So that means I can finally release my full analysis on the new characters that are joining the big Genshin cast. The first one I'll be talking about is Lyney, because it's the prized 5-star and I have to cash in on that hype as soon as possible. But don't you worry, the little guys are getting attention very soon as well. Lyney is the perfect example of how things aren't fundamentally changing with Fontaine. Sure, it's a new era, a new region, new characters, but nothing truly gameplay changing is being introduced. Sumeru was more of an exception, since they introduced a whole new element with it that favored specific mechanics, and the new Dendro characters that came out at that time had those specific peculiarities in their kits. In comparison, Lyney is a much more normal release, but that doesn't mean it can't be interesting and great, and in my opinion, it is. Out of all the characters that I've covered during my YouTube career, Lyney is the one whose passives indicate the playstyle in the clearest way possible. The Hoyoverse is basically screaming at us how it should be played, and we're listening. In fact, his second passive increases his Pyro damage bonus by 60% if the opponents he hits have Pyro applied on them, and this amount increases by 20% for each Pyro unit on the team other than himself, up to 2 times in total. Basically, in a mono Pyro team, Lyney will be getting the kind of damage increases other characters only get through elemental reactions. And this is amazing, because he's doing that without relying on any of the restrictions elemental gauges impose on you. Still, this wouldn't mean anything without a good kit surrounding it, so let's look into that. Lyney is a bow charge attack based character, and just like Tighnari and Ganyu, he comes with his own unique charged mechanics that make him stand out. The highlight here is that when he fully charges a shot, a grain masking hat will be created on field and taunt all opponents. Furthermore, it will explode if 4 seconds have passed, if it gets hit hard enough, or if another hat gets created, since only one can exist on field at a given time at Constellation 0. If his HPs are below 60%, stacks won't be charged. These stacks are only useful to power up his elemental skill, which will make the hats on field instantly explode, deal additional damage based on how many stacks Lyney is charged, and heal him back by the equal amount of HP that he lost while charging the stacks. The nice thing about this is that the elemental skill will make the explosion of Lyney's hats deal AoE damage instead of just single target. Lastly, his elemental burst will turn him into a flying hat for a couple seconds, which will deal damage to the opponents he goes in contact with, and then deal a final explosion damage when its duration ends. You can also end it prematurely by using the elemental skill button. After this happens, Lyney will gain a stack and create a hat on field. Note that this particular hat will deal less damage than the others he creates, because of his first passive which specifically buffs the hats he created through charge shots. So far, all good. Lyney is quite significant in terms of dealing raw damage. But one question I'm sure some of you are wondering about is this mono Pyro team actually good? At a glance it might seem like it isn't, but I promise you, it's better than what it seems. In general, a dominant presence on mono Pyro teams is Klee. Up until we got news of Lyney, in terms of raw damage dealt, Klee was the unquestionable best in-slot on-field carry for mono Pyro teams, especially because she could unleash it on an AoE range. Backed by a strong off-field DPS like Xianling, and broken supports like Kazuha and Bennett, she could absolutely put in a lot of work, and make mono Pyro one of the best teams for AoE content. But wait, isn't Lyney a single target damage dealer for the most part? If that's true, wouldn't it kinda change the identity of the team altogether? This is right, and this is the reason I wouldn't call Lyney a straight upgrade compared to Klee, but rather a very interesting alternative. In fact, the single target damage output Lyney can dish out can definitely put Klee to shame, and in general that makes his teams better than the Klee variants in that context. That higher damage contribution of his also makes him scale a bit better with investment, and he also has access to better weapons and constellations in general, but we'll get to that later. The big doubt, however, and this is what could possibly be Lyney's downfall from a meta standpoint, is that as a charge attack bow user, he might have a much higher reliance than Klee to shielders. It's true that he has access to taunts himself, but given that most taunts in the game have the accuracy of a drunkard, there is reasonable skepticism about Lyney being able to fit in the most offensive version of Mono Pyro perfectly. Specifically, the odd man out will be one between Kazuha and Xiangling, but the problem is that both of these characters are incredibly strong for the team. There is no variant that really compares to the perfect Mono Pyro team, because it's not only the strongest in terms of single target damage, but most importantly, it's by far the best in terms of AoE damage, because of how Kazuha's grouping can magnify things like Xiangling's Pyronado, and make the whole team better. A potential alternative to this would be replacing Kazuha with Lynette, which wouldn't be that bad since Lynette is an anemo unit that can deal solid damage and inflict resistance reduction effects to all opponents, while also having faster animation than Kazuha. The main appeal of her, however, is her burst being able to generate a taunt on field, and I have no idea of how two taunts could fare in real game scenarios, but it's surely worth a try. Other alternatives are quite a bit less enticing, as we're entering a range where I probably wouldn't suggest Lyney over Klee if these turn out to be his only playable options. We're talking about alternatives where one between Xiangling and Kazuha gets replaced by ultra defensive units like Deya, Zhongli, or Yanfei. These lineups are generally much lower in terms of overall damage output compared to the Kazuha variant, and probably have a good chance at giving you a bad impression of Lyney. The problem isn't even just the damage itself, it's that if you play him outside of his main Mono Pyro teams, I think the lack of AoE will really be felt, so you'd basically end up playing a charge attack version of Yoimiya. The one that is most promising to me out of these compositions is the variant with both Zhongli and Kazuha, which will allow you to run a very short rotation and get the most damage out of Lyney himself as a result, something that will do very well with high investment on him. Other than that, I'm not thrilled. I've also seen people asking about Lyney's potential on teams like Reverse Melt, so teams where opponents have Pyro applied on them most of the time, and there are slow application cryo units melting on the background. This outlook isn't very good for Lyney as opposed to somebody like Xiangling, because he'll be applying Pyro every 2 seconds on average, and mostly on a single target basis. Meaning that if you pair him with characters like Rosaria and Ayaka, what will happen is that the primary target might or might not retain the Pyro gauge, but the other targets definitely won't, as they mostly get hit by cryo. The positive note, however, is that based on the footage I've seen, Lyney's taunt seems pretty decent, so I don't think this scenario where he's unplayable on the offensive variants of Mono Pyro are totally realistic. Going off of this, as I said earlier, Lyney is a pretty interesting high investment potential, so let's take a look at his builds and constellations. First thing, the weapons. His signature is absurdly strong enough to make powerhouses like Aqua Simulacra look like training bows in comparison, by being 10% better assuming you have 3 Pyro characters on the team. That's a quite significant gap for a character whose damage contribution is often hovering around 60% or more on most of his teams. Still, the second tier weapons are pretty good, but the third tier weapons of my infographic, that's where it gets pretty grim, because if you want to optimize Lyney's damage and you have one of those weapons, then his signature becomes close to a must-fall in my opinion. Artifacts wise, the best in slot option is the new set that is coming out with Fontaine that I'm not going to try to spell out because I just know I will say it wrong. This new artifact set is pretty great for Lyney, who can get all of its stacks up pretty quickly during the rotation through charge attack HP loss. The Lava Walker set is also pretty good as a second best option, as it's just 7% below this crit rate set, and even the mixed artifact options are not drastically below that, so if you have great substats on them, they will work just fine. Now, let's move on to his constellations. In general, Lyney follows the recent trend of characters having very powerful early constellations, and in this case they might even be stronger than the usual. In particular, his Constellation 1 increases the amount of hats that can be on field by 1, and makes his first charge shot of every rotation create 2 hats at once, and generate an extra stack as well. Practically, this means that it will increase Lyney's rotation damage by the amount of the output of an extra hat explosion, which is definitely quite significant. His Constellation 2 increases his crit damage by a huge amount during this rotation, and his Constellation 3 is a special kind of talent level increase, since it affects his normal and charge attack talent, which is quite unusual for Genshin. From these 3 constellations, Lyney will get a total damage increase of 50%, quite great. The rest of his constellations aren't particularly impressive, with his Constellation 6 being the only remaining highlight, as it will basically increase the damage dealt by his charge shots by a significant amount. In general, Lyney is a character that will be able to deal great damage and very quickly at high constellation levels, and I expect a composition like Lyney, Constellation 2 Klee, Kazuha and Bennett to perform pretty well in speedrun context. Overall, Lyney is a great character. Hoyoverse has done a very good job designing his kit, and while I don't expect him to overshadow Klee, I think it will be a very interesting alternative, if not a decent upgrade depending on the situation. The only real issue could be if it's not possible to play him on the most offensive versions of Mono Pyro, but I don't necessarily expect that to be the case. I'm done for today. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a thumbs up, a comment and subscribe. See you next time!